Stardate 2658.9. Alright, so my trip is over, and I'm home now. I finished on September 19th. And there's a bunch of stories that I didn't tell from the last 322 miles. So I think in the last podcast, I was a few miles from getting to the border. And I made it to the border, finished, went into Canada, came home, and then I went back out about 3 weeks later, around the 1st of September, to get the 322 miles that I had missed in the, quote, low Sierras. So the way I'm going to do this podcast is I've written down sort of like a bunch of notes, and I'm just going to sort of go through them. They're things that I want to remember for the future. And then that'll be it. I'm going to post a whole bunch of stuff on Facebook, and it'll be in my last post for this particular trip. All right, so I'll just start with the top of my my notes here. Start at the top of my notes. All right, so on the last day, I saw some people, and I'd like to remember these moments. So there's this younger guy whose name is Bible, not to be confused with the other Bible, who was the one who got lost in the Sierras. And as I was approaching the border, he was coming back, and he really was like in sort of a state of shock and bliss, and yeah, just it was really fun to talk to. He sort of had stars in his eyes, and he was very philosophical and talking about how, no one could take the accomplishment away from him, and how he was realizing that things had value in life that weren't material things, and all these kind of funny, profound revelations that you tend to have when you're a younger dude. So it was really nice to run into him. And I also saw two other hikers who'd made it to the border and come back. So instead of going into Canada, they turned around and walked south because they didn't have permits to go into Canada. And also, once you're in Canada, it can be fairly expensive to get back to the U.S., depending on, what bus you take, or if you have to get a flight from Vancouver. So a lot of people just turn around and walk south. So these two dudes had walked south to a junction, and it was a really interesting junction because the sign actually said on it, PCT north, south, but then there's this other trail that goes east and west, and I forget the name of it exactly. It's something like, like Western Cascades Trail, and I think it was about 300 or 400 miles long, and it just headed west through the Cascades, apparently a much more beautiful part of the Cascades, to the Pacific Ocean. So they were just going to continue their hike in that direction, which was really interesting. There were some fires in that direction, but they didn't seem too worried about it. I also saw a woman whose name was Brazil Nuts, and she was Brazilian, and she had just completed her second PCT through hike, and she'd also completed the Appalachian Trail twice and the Continental Trail twice, and she had a fresh, brand new T-shirt that I guess she was wearing just for the occasion, and she'd made it to the border and was hiking south too, and it just said PCT ×2, AT ×2, CDT ×2. Just and she seemed so proud of it, and was a blast to talk to. She'd also completed the entire PCT in, I think it was 67 days, which matched the old record for the old speed record. So she was just absolutely flying, and I brought that up, and she seemed a little bit sad. She's like, "Yeah, I know, I got the old record." But I don't think she was thinking she was even going to be able to do that, and only in the last week really kind of like just started flying. She was all excited to go home and look at her GPS data to see, how fast she'd gone in her performance. And she was joking. She's like, I could tell, like where I stopped to go to the bathroom from the GPS because I only stopped for bathroom breaks. So that was awesome to run into her. Let's see, what else? Oh, one thing So then I made it to the border, which was fairly anticlimactic. You know, you're just in this sort of dense patch of woods. Um, there is a strange sort of stripe of cleared forest between the U.S. and Canada that goes, you know, in either direction, east and west, and it's very, very like perfectly cut. It almost looks like a laser from outer space has just, you know, cut this line through the country or between the countries, and you sort of imagine that like, you know, the maps that we all look at in schools um, actually have these real lines cut between them. Um, so that was kind of interesting. And they had a brand new monument there. I guess the old monument was getting, you know, kind of beaten up and was well worn. But I forgot to sign the log. So somewhere, either as part of the monument or near the monument, there was a log book. And, you know, you write your name in, and I guess that's partly, you know, the evidence that you've completed the trail. Um, but I totally forgot and didn't see the logbook anywhere, and just snapped some photos. There was a couple women there who'd hiked in from Manning Park who were staff, and you know, they took some pictures of me at the monument, and I took a couple pictures of them. But that was it, you know, sort of anticlimactic. So after that, I had to walk to Manning Park, which was 8 miles through. It wasn't a very good trail, and then head home. So yeah, um, at Manning Park, it's sort of like a touristy spot, but super nice. I ran in and said, "Hey, just finished the PCT. Do you guys have anything for people who finished?" And she's like, "You know, yeah, we have this little card. You can take a shower for free. You get a free soda and free Wi-Fi." So I was really interested in getting home as quickly as possible for a family vacation. So I took a shower real fast. That way I, you know, would be able to get a hitch to the neighboring town more easily without stinking. Got my free soda and saw Bones in at the bar, because that's where you get your free soda. So I went down there and was like, "Oh, hey, Bones, what's up?" And he was also kind of like in a blissed out, sort of relaxed state, and he was alone. None of his crew were there, and we actually had a really nice conversation about, you know, having finished the trail, and gossiped um, a bit about Bible and some of the other people that we both knew, and brought up also a hiker named Darwin, who we both like really didn't like. So it was kind of fun to talk to him about that, and just realize that, man, a lot of people don't like that dude Darwin. Okay, so what else is on my notes here? Free soda. Oh yeah, so then I went out to the road, and I was really pessimistic. I didn't think I was gonna get a ride, and I thought maybe I would just be sleeping on the concrete somewhere in a town called Hope, waiting for a bus. But within maybe 10 or 20 minutes, this woman pulled over, and she was like, "Hey, I never picked up a hitchhiker before in my life, but I just felt like I should pick you up and jump in." So she turned out to be a super interesting person who does like social work and takes into her own home younger people, like teenagers who have like drug issues or just, you know, issues in their life um, that make them very difficult people to kind of deal with, and was helping them integrate. So she told me some of those stories. Really interesting person. And as she was telling me those stories, off to our right, we noticed that there was a lot of smoke. And she was saying, "Oh, yeah, you know, when I drove up to Manning Park this morning, a fire had started very close to my hometown." So this was about maybe 8 hours later. And we were seeing, you know, how large the fire had grown since then. And there was a lot of smoke. And as we got closer to her town, she was, you know, really, I think, very surprised at how large the fire had grown. So, yet another fire. We could see helicopters sort of floating around in there, dropping dropping water on the fire, and she was telling me about the paratroopers they drop in. There's these dudes called um, smoke jumpers, and they're the guys that paratroop in. And then there's also these guys called hot shots, and I don't remember exactly how they're different from the paratroopers, but they're sort of like even more specialized in terms of, how um, militant they get with the fires and how many risks they take going in there. Um, so that was interesting. And she wouldn't take me to Hope. She absolutely refused to take me to Hope, to the bus station. She was going to take me all the way to Vancouver, to the airport. And that just totally floored me because it was maybe an hour and a half drive. So she was just the nicest person in the world. And she had Scooby-Doo floor mats in her car. So we decided that her trail angel name was going to be Scooby-Doo. And I told her I didn't really like my trail name that much, Hollywood, so she gave me a new trail name, which was Drought, because I told her that I didn't carry water. And I'm thinking maybe I'll use that name. I think it's more apt than Hollywood, and I just don't love the sound of it. Like Drought, it's sort of a negative thing. So it's it's like having a name that's like sadness or dark cloud or some gloominess. So I don't know if that trail name will stick, but it was an interesting idea. Um, so I got to the Vancouver airport. I didn't have a plane ticket, and of course was expecting to be, completely screwed by the price. But I got on my phone, and after half an hour of trying to connected to the internet, and got a 180 Canadian dollar ticket to Boston that night. Like it left, I don't know, an hour and a half after I arrived there. So just absolutely ridiculous that I had been on the PCT at the border at maybe 3 or 4 o'clock, and then without any plans at all, made it to Menning Park, which didn't have any bus service. Found this hitchhiker who'd never taken a hitchhiker before, all the way to Vancouver Airport, where I had no plan, and got probably the cheapest airline ticket I've ever got to go all the way from Vancouver to Boston in a straight shot. So that was just absolutely ridiculous. And I think the next day, in the late afternoon, I was with my family on family vacation. So that was just so wonderful. Um, so, fast forward 3 weeks later. Actually, I'm going to tell one story I forgot to tell, which was, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks before I got to the border. And I can't believe I forgot to tell this story because it's probably the weirdest thing that happened while I was on the whole trail. So I was in, I believe, the section between Snoqualmie and Stevens Pass, and I'd passed like a highway, maybe 20 miles earlier, and very beautiful lakes. But I was really high up, so the trail had gone sort of straight up some mountains, and I was between a couple passes in a burn area, so everything was just scorched, and there was nobody up there, and it was sort of late in the afternoon, maybe 5 o'clock. And there was a strange track on the trail. It almost looked like a road bike, like a thin tire. And I'd been staring at it for a while, kind of walking, trying to figure out what the heck it was. And I thought the closest I could come to was either it's somebody on a road bike, which was crazy, because bikes aren't allowed on the trail, and no one would ever take a road bike up there. Or maybe it was some kind of like a wheel device that someone was using to count miles. Sometimes they have those sort of tape measure things, but those are really old tech. Like you would never do that these days because you can very easily use a GPS to count miles, and there's no reason, to take a wheel to count miles. So, as I was wondering what the heck that was, I started to hear this person up ahead, maybe a quarter mile or half mile, just yelling like, "Hey, like, are you there? Help!" Something like that. And it was kind of weird. It was like a little bit aggressive, maybe frustrated, um, but I didn't know what it was. So, I sort of was cautiously walking forward, and I still had a few miles to go to get to my camp spot. But it seemed like I was going to overtake this person, whoever they were, and I hoped maybe they were, just down on the trail, on a different trail somewhere down by one of the lakes that were a few thousand feet below me. So eventually, I caught up to this person, um, and from behind, I couldn't tell what was going on. But as I got closer, I realized that there was a guy dragging a suitcase on wheels. So the kind of suitcase that you'd take through an airport that has an extendable handle, and wheels on the bottom. Except the handle, I guess, that part of it had broken off, and instead of a handle, he'd attached a blue strap, almost like a seat belt. So a blue sort of seat belt strap. It was about 5 or 6 feet long, and he had tied it around the handle of the suitcase. And on the other end was this sort of metal latch, and he just wrapped that around his wrist a couple times and was dragging this like fairly large suitcase. Like it was, it couldn't have fit in the overhead compartment on an airplane. This is the kind of bag that you would have checked. So he was dragging that, and he had kind of beat up dreads and like a tie-dye bandana and a tie-dye shirt with like a Grateful Dead logo. So just sort of like classic hippie, the kind of person that you'd see, at an outdoor concert on a hill in Vermont. And he had a large pit bull with him, like powerful looking pit bull. So I came up to him, and we had a fairly brief conversation. He basically was saying like, "Oh yeah, I'm looking for my friend. I can't find my friend. We were supposed to meet out here and go fishing." And that was the other thing. He had a fishing rod sort of like slung over his shoulder. And I asked him if he needed help, figuring out where he was on maps or GPS, something like that. And I showed him, on my phone where we were, and I showed him where the camp spots were and where water was, because he looked like he was in, potentially a bad situation. He had food, he had some food, and I asked him if he had a sleeping bag. He said he had a quilt, so I assumed that meant like a down quilt. But later on, it turned out that no, it was just like a for real, just like a cotton quilt that he'd stuffed um, in this bag, in this suitcase. So I was like, all right, and I, kind of made sure he was all right, and really nice guy actually. So I walked ahead a couple miles and finally found a spring because there was no water anywhere, and filled up. And he caught up to me there, saw what I was doing, and was just absolutely overjoyed that there was a water source. I guess he was really thirsty because, he dragged this suitcase 20 something miles. And just to give you an idea, like the trail is not really wide enough to easily drag the suitcase. Like he was dragging it up rough terrain in some places, and it was just kind of banging around. It wasn't like a smooth trail where the wheels were helping that much. And his wrist looked pretty raw from where the strap had been, chafing his wrist. So we got water, talked a little bit more, and then I went and found the campsite. There's a few other people there, and eventually saw him go by and was asking him, what his plan was. And his plan was to just keep walking until he found his friend, which didn't seem like the best plan to me since we were in a burn area and everything was just toast and it was just like charcoal everywhere. So I did my thing. I got ready for bed and got in my bivvy and was maybe about to go to sleep around 10:30, 11 o'clock. And I started hearing like, the squeaky wheels of his suitcase again coming back on the trail. And he found the campsite, and I talked to him a little bit, and he's like, yeah, I couldn't find my guy. And that's when I saw what was in his suitcase, and it literally was just a big quilt stuffed in there, And he also had a hammock, like a cloth hammock that he was able to rig up, and some food for his dog, um, and some food for himself. So yeah, he went to sleep with us all there, and yeah, it's just so bizarre. So I think he was. I'd met people like him before, but not on the PCT, on the Appalachian Trail towards the beginning. The sort of people that you'd meet down in Georgia, who like clearly didn't really have any place to stay and were homeless, um, or were out there actually kind of on the run, trying to get away from the cops or something. This was sort of the West Coast equivalent of that, just like the hippie version of the Appalachian Trail, guy, like from Appalachia. So anyway, things worked out for him in the morning. His friend showed up, and they had this sort of like argument about friendly argument about where they were supposed to have met and all this stuff. And the friend apparently had been out there before, but this was this guy's first time out there, and the friend eventually softened up and was like, well, you did really good for your first time out here. So I was like, okay, that's really good. But, he was genuine, and they started going around. The other guy had some traps, so I guess he was trying to trap some small critters for them to eat, and he also had a fishing pole. But one of the arguments they had before I left was about the blue strap that was attached to the suitcase. And the guy was like, the friend was like, I really need that strap back. Like, I've had that for 10 years, and that's my strap. And I don't think he needed it for anything, at the moment. There was no pressing uh, task that he needed the strap for. But the other guy so clearly, desperately needed this strap to be able to drag his suitcase. It was just kind of like, I was like, oh man, knife to the heart. You're going to take away his blue strap. That thing was, the only thing keeping him connected to that suitcase. He'd probably just ditch it on the side of the path if it wasn't for that strap. So anyway, yeah, I set off and hiked about 5 miles through really, really bad burn, imagining that this is what that dude had been hiking through in the dark the night before. And, definitely a good idea that he turned around, because there was just nothing in there. It would have been a miserable night out in the burn. So that was probably my weirdest story from the trail, from the Washington section. And so now I'll fast forward to the family vacation, and I had 3 weeks, and it was really nice. I got to see my brother and his family, and my mom, and hang out with lots of people. So once that was over, I was faced with the decision: should I go back and try to get those 322 miles that I didn't get yet in the Sierras? And I was struggling it with a little bit. It was really nice to be home, and it was going to cost a fair amount of money to get flights back and forth out there just to get these 322 miles. But, I became very clear in my head that, yes, I did want to do this and properly finish the Pacific Crest Trail, finish my thru hike. So I headed out to Sacramento. Flight got delayed 5 hours, but I eventually made it by bus to Truckee, and then I took an Uber to the Donner Ski Ranch, which was the last time I saw Wishy and Padre, and also the last time I saw Four Eyes and River. So all of the people that I'd hiked with at various times for any real length of time, I'd last seen there. So it was kind of a cool to be back there. So I spent a night there, and then set off. So so then I was hiking, and the first night out was rather shocking. It was so cold. It was down in the 20s, and I was not prepared. I had made a decision not to bring my down pants, and was just pretty miserable, pretty grumpy, exhausted. I had a headache from traveling in the flight, and thought I'd made a terrible mistake. And I still had 322 miles to go. Like, what was I doing? I didn't know anybody. There were still fires that were actually in the section I was hiking in, and just generally was in an awful space. Um, but that got a lot better. Let's see. I'm gonna check my notes here. 3 weeks. Oh, right. So, yes, that got a lot better quickly. And one of the reasons was since I'd had those 3 weeks of rest, my body had had time to heal. So my knees had almost completely healed. I wasn't sore in the rest of my body. My blisters on my toes had all kind of gone away. But I was still in really, really good shape from hiking, 2,300 miles. So I was in this sort of like optimized, perfect hiking condition where nothing was broken, everything was working great. And I very quickly realized that this was going to be absolute bliss. And I just started flying, every day I would just go, my full distance, my full 30 miles very quickly. But I would do it, almost like skipping around and jumping off of rocks and like jogging little bits and just flying by other people that were hiking there and just having an absolute blast. So that's something that I would recommend to any other hikers who finished a thru hike, to realize that maybe 3 weeks after you finish or a month after you finish, you enter into this zone where you're at this like optimal fitness level, but you're also completely restored. And it's a really wonderful place to be. So it might be a great time to do like an ultra marathon, or some bike races, or just do something where you can take advantage of that, of that state, and really have some fun with the with your body, with like seeing what your body is capable of when it's both happy and healthy, and also in the best condition it's ever been in. So that's one thing that made the hiking really awesome. And I eventually made it to South Echo Lake and got taken into South Lake Tahoe by a trail angel there. I called. There was this big list of numbers, and she was super nice. She was an old, I think, elementary school teacher or middle school teacher who had lived there her whole life, and was just an awesome person. And ended up at a hostel in South Lake Tahoe. I kind of got stuck there, though, because it was Labor Day weekend, and the bus that I needed to get on to get around fire in the next section wasn't running on the weekend, and it also wasn't running on Monday, which was Labor Day. Um, so, so yeah, I just got stuck there. But it was kind of cool because I met this other hiker, the only PCTer I'd seen since I went back out west, and his trail name was Soulcraft, and he was just this really like friendly, sweet guy, a math teacher who'd been Sobo. So he was telling me all sorts of interesting statistics about what his trail had been like. He's a numbers guy, so he'd actually counted the number of people that he'd passed going south. So those are the Nobos. So sort of like my peers, all the other people who, like me, were hiking from Mexico to Canada, he'd passed all of them. And in Washington, all of them that were still hiking, that is. So he said there was roughly 2,200 people that he passed. And I think about 10,000 people started the trail. So that was an interesting number to get. On the official PCTA website, it says only 202 people have finished so far, but I expect that number, based on what Soulcraft was saying, to get up somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 at least in the next couple months. The other interesting thing he said was, as he was hiking south, he would pass, the Nobos, and they'd say things like, "Oh man, there's so many of you southbound hikers. I've passed 7 or 8 of you today." And Soulcraft would be like, "I passed 264 of you today." Because he was counting. And the people would just be sort of like, confused and say, "You mean you've seen 264 total?" And Soulcraft would be like, "No, today, 264." So, people just don't know that they're in these bubbles. It's like an escalator, or, where if you get on at a certain point, everybody's moving at roughly the same speed by the time they get to Oregon or Washington, and might feel alone in the forest, but literally there's hundreds of people that same day passing the places that you pass. So it was just really cool to meet Soulcraft, and we went out and got pizza and beer one night, and he was telling me all about you know, his girlfriend back home, or all kinds of stuff. So I also ran into a woman there named Shuttle, who I think was in her late 40s, and she recognized me from earlier in the trail. She was really cool. And I'm mentioning these people because they all became sort of my hiking partners in the following week and a half or 2 weeks while I finished. And another couple, two women from London, were there who were doing shorter sections, and they turned out to be pretty cool. So anyway, eventually Tuesday arrived, and we patched together, all of us, Soulcraft and the couple. I think one of their names was Meg. We'd patched together a bus route to get down to a town called Bridgeport, where we were going to get a ride from a local there up to Sonora Pass and get back on the trail where the burn section ended. So that all worked out great. Oh, and Shuttle. So it was Soulcraft, Shuttle, and the couple. So that all worked out great. As we were approaching Bridgeport, it looked really stormy. So I was sad about that. It's like, oh man. I mean, it looked really stormy. And this is the Sierras proper now. So you're looking at these enormous mountains off to your right as the highway just like zooms across. And they just look absolutely evil. It looks like Mordor. And, the clouds above them sort of slowly spiraling, and lightning strikes and all kinds of stuff. So we got to Bridgeport and jumped in Karen's car. Karen was the local who was taking us up to Sonora Pass. Lou, her husband, is usually the one who takes people up, but he was having surgery that day, a quadruple bypass, and pretty serious surgery for him. And Karen didn't know, if he was going to even make it. So she was in sort of like a PTSD state of mind, and I was surprised that she was, still willing to take us anywhere. But anyway, so we all jumped in the car and started heading up there. And right away, she said, there's a new fire up there. And we were like, you mean the Donnell fire, which was the fire that we were trying to get around. And she said, no, the storms that we got this afternoon, there were some lightning strikes. And around 2 p.m., a fire started, and it's already burned about 100 acres. And so that started at 2 p.m. So we got there at about 5 p.m. So that's 3 hours after the fire started. And she said, don't worry, they haven't closed 108 yet, so we can get up there and I can drop you off. And immediately all of us were kind of like, quiet and looking at each other and thinking, like, okay, is this safe? We're going out to the trailhead that's pretty close to where a fire is starting. So as we drove closer to Sonora Pass, I think it took about an hour to get there, we started seeing a lot of smoke from the fire, and then we started seeing bare flames from the fire, and they were pretty intense. And the fire was also moving south, which was not only where Karen was going to drop us off, but we were going to be walking south. So the fire was close to the trailhead and moving in the direction of the trailhead, and then moving in the direction that we were going to hike. So it started to seem like less and less of a good idea to be out there. Karen, on the other hand, was very laissez-faire, or how do you say that? That's not the right expression. Laissez-faire. She was very relaxed about the whole thing. And she said, she was saying like, well, there'll be smoke up there, but you'll see when I drop you off. It's pretty far from where the fire is. Don't worry. Um, but as we got closer and closer, it really didn't look safe at all, and there was quite a lot of smoke, especially down in the valley, where it was just so dense. It was like a solid wall of smoke, and you absolutely wouldn't want to go down in there. Um, so the couple from London, they really were very worried. One of them especially was just like, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? This is insane. We need to go back to Bridgeport. Soulcraft, on the other hand, is a pretty reckless guy in general, and had basically expressed to me and everyone who would talk to him the fact, like his desire to be on the PCT is he wanted to be challenged, and he really wanted to be in difficult, dangerous situations where his ability to survive was tested. He wanted to come through those situations. So he was basically like salivating at this opportunity to go and survive a fire. So he wasn't the best person necessarily to be involved in the decision making about this, like whether we should go or not. And later I realized that Karen also, our driver, might not be the best person either, since her husband was having surgery that day. So she was probably in a very different state of mind than normal, and her priorities and thinking process were probably all affected by, like the mortality that she'd been, up against the past few days. So really, like, the only clear-headed people in the car were the couple from London and myself. And I'd seen a bunch of fires in Washington, and I'd sucked a bunch of smoke down and been in those situations before. They didn't have any experience at all, so I think they were a little bit more worried than me, but I was pretty worried. So we got to the trailhead, and like I said, a ton of smoke. There was another hiker up there whose name was TikTok, probably in his mid-60s, a thru hiker. It turned out to be a chemical engineer. And he didn't know what was going on. He's like, yeah, it was clear like a few hours ago, and suddenly all this smoke, I don't know what's going on. And there was ash falling on us, like not hot ash, but just the white pieces, maybe a 1/4 inch in size. And so we told him all about the fire, and he seemed kind of confused, but not that concerned. And he'd already hiked 30 miles that day, so he was not going anywhere. He was going to camp there at the road. So we stood there and tried to make the decision. It took about 15 minutes, but for whatever reason, we decided to hike and not to go back to Bridgeport. And our ride drove away, and we were left there, and there was nobody on the road. And yeah, we were out in the middle of nowhere with a brand new fire less than 10 miles from us, headed towards us. And it was 6 p.m. at night. I mean, I shouldn't be laughing. It was like really surreal to be there and to realize that we'd willingly put ourselves in that situation. So we started hiking, and the plan that we'd come up with in the car that I'd suggested was that just, psychologically it'd be good to put some distance between us and the fire. And so why didn't we all hike about 10 miles straight south, to get away from the fire? And, why don't we hike together as a group for safety, just in case the smoke got really bad or we needed, to help each other out. So the other thing that we discovered shortly was the couple from London were both nurses, or they were in training to be doctors and were in, doing residencies or something. So that was good. And yeah, we just started hiking. The smoke was pretty bad. The sunset was absolutely gorgeous. So we got up on top of Sonora Pass, and we got the sunset sort of cutting through the smoke, and just all these unbelievable pastel colors. I tried to get some of it on film, take pictures, and you can kind of see how beautiful it was, but just doesn't do it justice. And so we made it about 6 miles in and went around a corner on top of a ridge and got our first real view back north so we could see the fire. And again, we could see bare flames. And the fire had moved significantly since we'd seen it earlier. It wasn't 10 miles from the road from 108 where we'd been dropped off. It was probably more like 6 miles from the road. So in 3 or 4 hours, it had moved, 3 or 4 miles. And it was basically completely dark at that point. So the bright, yellow-orange flames really stood out, and you could see how big they were because they were silhouetting some of the trees on some of the larger ridges. And yeah, it must have been 20 or 30-foot flames. The fire was also advancing towards us in a V shape. So it was literally pointed directly at us. It was like a big flaming arrow pointing at us. And as we stood there looking back at it, watching it for about 5 minutes, it visibly advanced. So, it was making progress towards us. We could also see the headlights, I guess, of Forest Service rangers on 108, so we could sort of see where we'd come from. And we could see their headlights also in other places, through the woods, all through the woods. So there definitely was a lot of crews in there fighting the fire. And earlier, when we were driving, we'd seen some helicopters in there too. So there were lots of, firefighters in there working on the fire. And I think one of the reasons why it looked so clearly like a V, an arrow shape, is that the firefighters had groomed it into that shape. I'm not exactly sure why that's helpful, but one of the girls said, like, oh, that looks like a well-organized fire. So maybe she knew something about the way that firefighters organize fires. But we were all, frankly, like, fairly terrified looking back at this thing. And we still had about 4 miles to go. So we turned around, and I wish I had some video of that fire, but I just wasn't thinking about that. And we headed out. Another interesting thing that happened that night, maybe half an hour later, as we were going over one of the ridges really high up, was we saw a jackrabbit run right in front of us. And then behind it, about 15 feet from us, there were these glowing eyes. And we were shining our flashlights in that direction, but it was just out of the reach, of our flashlights on the ground, except we could see these green glowing eyes. And at first, I was like, oh, it's got to be something on the trail, something small, don't worry about it. And then it sort of moved in a way that suggested it was flying. It moved off to the right very quickly through the air. And I'd seen that before, so I was like, oh, don't worry, guys. It's like, I've seen these birds before. They hang out on the trail and they look scary, but then they just fly off, don't worry. But Soulcraft then said, like, no, that's a wolf. And sure enough, like, as we got closer and we got our flashlights on it a little bit more, it was a very large wolf. And the way that it was moving, like the sort of nimble, like dancing step that it had made it look like it was flying. Like, it was moving that fast and that high in the air. And I guess we'd interrupted its hunt of this jackrabbit. And it was sort of looking at us, and we all grouped up, so there was 4 of us all together, and made some noise and scared it off. But man, that thing was huge. It reminded me of the dire wolves on Game of Thrones, somewhere in between the size of what you think a real wolf should be and a dire wolf. Sort of a gray-white wolf. So we continued south, and thank God it cleared up. The smoke really wasn't an issue once we got on the south side of some ridges and got down into a valley and found some nice streams and rivers. and we made it about 10 miles. So we stopped about 11 p.m. at night, and set up camp, and we all ate together and we talked about how crazy the day was. And one of the girls was saying that she wasn't going to be able to sleep, that she was still terrified, and thought that there was a chance, we'd wake up in the middle of the night, coughing up smoke and with flames coming down, the side of a hill at us or something like that. But that didn't happen. We woke up in the morning, and it was clear skies, clear blue sky. I'd woken up a few times during the night and just looked out of my tent, and I'd seen the stars very clearly, so I wasn't worried. And yeah, that was it. So I hiked with the girls for a little while in the morning, just because we were still a little spooked, but everything seemed fine, and I said goodbye to them. And that was basically sort of the end of that adventure. That was last time I saw them. I soul craft a bunch further down the trail, but that was the last time I saw them. All right, let's see, checking my notes. Okay. Yeah, so I started seeing, as I was hiking south, lots of hikers headed north. And because the fire had started the day before, none of them knew anything about it. So I was telling them about it, but I didn't really know what to tell them. I didn't know if the fire service had controlled the fire and put it out. I didn't know if Route 108 was open or closed. There was no other way for these hikers to get out. So it was a series of sort of funny conversations where I'd relay the information, and then they would sort of look at me kind of dumbfounded and ask, well, what do we do? And I was just like, I don't know. Like, maybe just keep going and, look out for smoke. And I don't know what to do. I don't know, what your exit plan is. It's, so it's kind of a funny spot to be in. But later I learned that the name of the fire was the Boot Fire, and I don't think it actually ever crossed Route 108. So I'm pretty sure that most of those hikers would have been all right. It might have been hard for them to get a hitch out on the road if no one was, driving on the road. But besides that, I think they were probably okay. So I had a wonderful time hiking the next few days. Made it to Tuolumne Meadows, which is really close to Yosemite Park. And I'm not sure if you guys saw the news earlier in the season in August, but they closed Yosemite Park for a while because there was so much smoke coming in from a fire called the Lions Fire. I think there were actually multiple fires. So a lot of the people whose vacations had been canceled were back in there, and the place was absolutely packed. They had something like 300 spots for cars to camp, and they were all taken. So there was 300, cars in there, probably well over 1,000 people. But it was still kind of nice. I stayed there for the night and watched the John Muir Ranger, or the John Muir show. They have an amphitheater, and around 7 or 8 at night, they start a little bonfire in the amphitheater, and a ranger comes out and tells some tale about the park. And so she told us all about John Muir and had an album that she passed around so we could see pictures of John Muir and understand his significance in creating some of the parks out there and what he did, for the National Park Service and all that stuff. Yeah, so the fire that we'd all run away from was named the Boot Fire. So eventually it got a name, and it was called the Boot Fire. So after Tuolumne Meadows, it was absolutely gorgeous hiking. This, really long, straight stretch with huge lakes, just gorgeous. And I started to run into a bunch of JMT hikers, and JMT stands for John Muir Trail. The John Muir Trail overlaps the Pacific Crest Trail for about 300 or 400 miles, I believe, from Mount Whitney to basically Tuolumne Meadows. So these are people who are going to be out maybe a month and a half, and a lot of them they're definitely not in as good shape as Pacific Crest Trail hikers. They hike much more slowly. They're people who, are keeping their jobs and are fitting it in on a vacation, or it's been on their bucket list and they're locals. Um, so somewhat less serious hikers, but still out there, for a while. Um, so I started meeting a bunch of them, and it was kind of fun because they're hiking so much slower than the PCT hikers that you just absolutely fly past them, and you start to get a sense for your real pace. You start to, because you have something to compare it to, you start to get a sense for how fast you're moving, and especially like I was talking about before with not feeling sore or injured, or because you've had all that rest, and you start to feel like I don't know, like a sail. If you see two sailboats, in the ocean, and one is sort of like got a small sail, and another boat just like flies by it, you start to feel just like you're invincible or something. It was just a really cool feeling, and a lot of them were curious about my hike because being a few weeks into theirs and suffering a lot, they're sort of, wide-eyed and can't imagine someone being out there for, you know, let alone a month or two, but, half a year. So that was kind of fun. So I missed going to VVR, which was a resort out in the middle of nowhere, by about 2 hours, and I was really bummed by that. And the reason I missed it was there's a ferry that takes you across a lake to VVR, and it only runs twice a day. So, for anybody who's familiar with VVR and was hoping that I'd make it there to have the experience, I didn't, unfortunately. I got there late, and just continued on. So my next stop was a place called Red's Meadow, which also is sort of out in the middle of nowhere, but has a little bit more connection to civilization. There's like a horse farm out there, or horse ranch, and they had like a restaurant, and there was a road. So I took the last bus of the season, and it literally was the last bus of the season. And the woman filled up the bus. I was the only person on it, with empty plastic buckets for her garden, and she had probably a couple hundred of them just stacked up on the seats. And she chatted to me over the intercom the whole way back, the whole way down to Mammoth, and was telling me all about her son, who was in the military on assignment in Italy. So that was a really nice connection, and she told me all about the good places to eat in Mammoth, and where I should stay. So I ended up at an RV park in Mammoth, and got everything done that I needed to do, resupplied, laundry, shower, all that stuff. And randomly, next morning, I ran into Shuttle at a breakfast spot. And if you don't remember, Shuttle is that woman in her 50s who I'd run into at South Lake Tahoe who recognized me. And she's awesome. So we decided very quickly that we should split the cost of a cab to get back to Red's Meadow, to keep hiking, because our options were fairly limited since the bus had stopped running. So I went back up there with her, and stayed up there that night. So at that point, the hiking in the Sierras got pretty serious. We were going up much larger passes. I think Selden Pass was one of them, Silver Pass was one of them, Donahue Pass, and then finally Muir Pass, which was the pass that I stopped at the first time I was in the Sierras. So I didn't go up Muir Pass in the Sierras for fear that there would just be such an enormous amount of snow there that I would be slowed down and run out of food, which probably would have happened. So yeah, I mean, it was absolutely gorgeous. I can't stress enough how beautiful hiking in the Sierras is in September, and how awful it was in May. So if anyone, ever plans a trip in there, go in September or maybe mid-August. And the reason is there's no mosquitoes, and earlier in the year it's literally mosquito Armageddon. It's absolutely horrible. Another reason is the river crossings are basically a non-issue. You almost never get your feet wet, and you can rock hop easily or make it over on logs. And these are river crossings that actually kill people earlier in the year in May and had in 2017. So no mosquitoes, no river crossings. Of course, the snow, so you don't have your feet freezing underneath, a foot or two of snow all day long post-holing and feeling like you're just drowning. There's more people in there, so there's the JM tiers. There's not so many JM tiers that it's annoying, like it would be maybe in July when they all start. And the temperature is absolutely perfect. It's like, between 55 and 65 degrees and not too windy, and it's just freaking gorgeous. Probably the best hiking I've ever had. And I'll likely want to go back in there someday, just to experience that again. Other people had that same idea. When I was in there, I ran into people who'd finished the PCT in other years who were just hiking routes in there because they loved it so much. And one of those groups, actually, there's a group of 4 of them. The last person in the group was a guy named Phoenix, who I'd run into twice before on the PCT. Once in Washington on the worst day, absolute worst day of my hike, and because of the mosquitoes. And this was the guy who refused to use DEET, so he'd gone basically insane, and I'd been trying to sort of counsel him and keep him from just absolutely losing his mind from mosquitoes in Washington. And the other time I'd run into him was the day that I bailed in the Sierras. So as I was going out Bishop Pass, sort of like totally scared and, out of food and exhausted, I'd run into him. So I was running into him again at Bishop Pass. It was totally bizarre. The weirdest coincidence ever. I was like, oh my God, like how am I running into the same person, at the spot, where everything went wrong for me earlier in the hike. Again, I don't know. It was just absolutely bizarre. So we hung out for a while. He's an awesome guy. So I might get in touch with him, and I'm going to share some videos with him, and maybe there's like some destined thing, like we're destined to start a company together or a website or something, or maybe like hike another trail together. So eventually, after Muir Pass, which has a nice little stone hut on the top, very cold pass, I made it down to the ranger station, at Bishop Pass, and stayed there that night. So the next morning was what I thought was going to be the last day of my hike, going out Bishop Pass. Absolutely beautiful. I got up on the pass and there was some ice. I ran into a bunch of other people going up the pass and sort of like blew by all of them and made it over the pass. And then ran into one of the weirder things I'd found. It was about 20 or 30 elk that had been crushed in an avalanche right along the side of the trail. And something had smelled weird for a while, for maybe like the past 10 minutes as I was hiking down the pass. But when I came upon this, it's just, I have it on the video, just one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. These really large boulders, maybe 5 or 6 feet across, and the elk were just all, littered underneath these things. One of the people there I talked to said someone actually caught it on video when it had happened earlier in the year, had seen the snow and rocks crush them all, and had gone over to the elk, and some of their heads, I guess, were still sticking out of the snow, and they were suffering. So the people had to slit their throats, and it's all on video on YouTube somewhere apparently. So there's this ghastly video on YouTube I could probably track down, but won't. So let's see what else in my notes. Went out Bishop Pass. So I got down to the parking lot. The bus wasn't running anymore, but I got a hitch from a really nice local pretty quickly, an electrical engineer, retired, and he took me down to the hostel in Bishop, which is a great hostel. So I thought I was done, but just for kicks, I went on the PCTA website, checked to see what was going on with the Donnell fire closure, and lo and behold, they'd opened it. So that was another section, about 70 miles, that I could finish. So I had this choice yet again, should I consider my hike done and go home or get those 70 miles? And I decided, well, I really have to get those miles. I was within, a few hours bus ride, so I needed to do it. So I took a 00 in Bishop. I had a really nice time. Soulcraft showed up. We had a great time, catching up. And then I ran into Shuttle in town and caught up with her. So it was really awesome hiking with those guys for a while. TikTok was the other person that I'd continued to see off and on. Like one of these mid 60s, maybe even in his 70-year-old hikers who was doing 30 miles every day. Really inspiring. So yeah, so I got the bus back to Bridgeport. This time, instead of Karen taking me up, Lou took me up. And at one point, he lifted up his shirt and showed me the scar from his quadruple bypass. And I told him that my dad also had a quadruple bypass, and we talked. So we had a lot to sort of connect about and talk about. Really interesting, wonderful guy. Extremely slow driver. I think it took him about 3 times as long as his wife to drive me up to Sonora Pass. Like, it literally took hours to drive up there. And I started hiking. So I had a beautiful 3 days of hiking. I started passing Sobos. I passed about 10 Sobos a day and got to talk to them. And on the last day of my hike, I ran into Tang, who I'd first met at Kennedy Meadows, 700 miles in, and we kind of connected because she was from Portsmouth, which is where I was living before I started my hike. And then I ran into her again in Washington after she'd started a Sobo hike because she'd hurt her ankle, and we'd talked a bunch in Washington, And then this was her again on the last day of my hike, and we talked a bunch, and she was going to be back in Portsmouth with her boyfriend, and had some job. I don't know. It's just awesome to have some continuity and like have these really unlikely encounters with both Tang and Phoenix at these pivotal moments on my hike. So it's just really awesome to run into her. So that night, I was going to spend my last night out in the woods and finish my hike the next day. That way I could save $30, I wouldn't stay in the hostel. So I started setting up camp about 2 or 3 miles from the road, and I started hearing this, like the helicopter, like the sound of the helicopter blades. And this helicopter arrived and started circling me, like really almost directly over my head. And I was looking up and I could see the guys in the helicopter looking down, looking right at me. And I'm sure that like our eyes connected. And after they went around a few times, they opened the doors on the bottom of the helicopter, and out fell a lot of water, like tons of water. And it landed maybe 50 to 80 feet from where I was starting to set up camp. And I got sprayed by a lot of it. I think if I was directly underneath it, the weight of the water would have like probably injured me pretty badly. But, luckily it was just a bit of spray and not so much that I was completely drenched. But I realized looking over where they dumped the water that there must be a fire, like 150, maybe 80 or 100 feet from where I was planning to set up camp for the night. So, I had like a, a what the heck is going on moment, but, very quickly packed up my stuff because it was just not a good place. I didn't see any smoke. I thought maybe it was a training exercise. Maybe they were dumping water on a target. But that didn't make any sense because it was so close to the PCT trail. Like, they would never set up a target that close. So as I started hiking down, the helicopter came back several more times. Maybe, 5 or 6 more times. And I could see it at certain points sort of become a dot over South Echo Lake. And I realized it was refilling, its water tanks from the lake. And it was doing it fairly quickly, so it would only be gone maybe 5 minutes before it was back and dumped more water in that spot. And I started to realize, sort of like, wow, how much water one of those helicopters can really drop on a spot. Like, it doesn't seem like a ton of water when they drop one, but when you see how many times they drop it and how quickly they're able to drop it, you start to realize, like, oh wow, these helicopters really can do some damage to a fire that maybe is not yet out of control. So sure enough, up the trail as I was walking down to the road, an older woman, sort of in fire gear, came up, and next to her a guy in like full fire gear, with like the hat and like the fireproof suit and everything, came up the trail, and I asked them if I was good to walk out if there was any issue, and they were like, yeah, no problem, go out. Someone started a fire up there. I don't know how they were sure that someone started the fire and that it wasn't started naturally, but they sort of kept charging up the trail in a clearly grumpy mood. And then a little bit later, a few minutes later, I came across 4 younger guys in full fire gear, who asked me if I had called it in. They were like, "Are you the guy that called it in?" And I was like, "No, I didn't call it in." And they looked at me really suspiciously. So my guess, or one guess, is that whoever started the fire may have also called the fire in, and they were looking for that person out there and thought maybe it was me. But anyway, they didn't question me too much and let me go. And then 5 minutes after that, I ran into a hiker who was going south. So he was going to hit the fire. And at that point, there was a fair bit of smoke, and you could actually see some bare flames through the trees. And he was looking up there and asked me, he's like, "What's going on up there?" So I told him, the fire has just started. It's really close to the trail. There's, about 6 people in there now fighting it, and the helicopter is fighting it. And he was trying to figure out what to do. And we looked on our GPSs really quickly, and I was sort of looking back at where I remembered the trail. And finally I said to him, "You know what? If you just run right now, you'll make it. There's guys up there, and the fire is probably not moving that fast. It was only 20 minutes ago that I was there trying to set up camp. I'm pretty sure that you'll make it if you run." So he got this like big grin on his face when I said that, and said something like, he was like, "Hell yeah." And then he just took off, at sort of a jog. So I was like, all right, I understand that. But also, why do we do this? And I was recalling the night that, the 4 of us had set off in the smoke, like what sort of decision-making process makes this okay? Just what in human beings? Not just one human being, but like a whole bunch of them in a group even, make a decision to run towards fire simply to, get the miles in and have an unbroken footpath, to have this accomplishment. So I don't know what's wrong with human beings. But anyway, I made it out to the road. It was completely dark at that point, so I didn't really have any chance of getting a hitch. And luckily my phone got service, so I called an Uber. It was kind of expensive, Uber, getting back down into South Lake Tahoe, and I stayed at a hostel that night, and that was the end of my trip. So the next day, got a bus to the airport at Reno, and and I was back on the East Coast. So that was it. I'm going to check my notes here to see if there's anything else. Yeah, I recognized a bunch of the Sobos that passed me. That was one thing I was going to mention. But yeah, that was it. So my trip is over. This is my last podcast journal entry for the PCT, and I'm going to post a bunch of other stuff. Thank you to everybody or anybody who's been listening to these things. It's really fun to record them, and I'm sure that I'll listen to them again someday. But yeah, thanks for following along. on this adventure, and I hope everyone's doing great. That's it for me. Rafe out. End trip.